Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I've got in front of me in this little green tub is it's my batch of African nightcrawlers. And this little tub, it's not very large. It's probably one of the smaller sized tubs that I've done any vermicomposting in. But this tub's been in service now for 118 days. And it was 2 weeks ago today, when the bin was 104 days old, that I had decided that I'd pretty much reached capacity on this container. So it was really time to stop using it as a composting bin, and I decided it was time to try to bait the worms out of the material, just have them exit the material voluntarily so that they could be scooped out and relocated. And then at some point, once the material inside the bin has been depopulated, I could simply harvest the worm castings. So 2 weeks ago, I nudged all of the material over onto this side of the container, and then I set up a feeding area only on this far edge in order to try to lure the worms out. So I let that go for a week. And a week ago, we checked in on it one more time. And at that point, all we did at that stage was we replenished some of the food that had been consumed by the worms that had already moved in. And we did take some time to inspect how the material on this side's looking to see if, in fact, our attempt at relocating the worms to migrate the worms out of the material was, doing good, or what the story was. So we did actually see that the material was coming along pretty nicely in terms of the number of worms that had been in there, significantly dropping after a week's time. But now after 2 weeks time, I'm very curious to see how things are progressing. So besides doing what we did last week, which is to come in here and make sure that the feeding zone is still adequately supplied with food, we're going to do the same thing, as we're going to check to see how the depopulation of the worms is progressing. However, I thought I would change things up here and try to put a little bit more of an optimistic spin on this. But even though it's only been 2 weeks, and it doesn't seem realistic to expect that all of the material has been depopulated, I figured I would come down here without any food, and maybe with the high hopes of actually seeing that the castings have in fact already been depopulated entirely, and now it would just be a matter of relocating the worms and putting the castings into storage. Chances are we're still probably going to find some worms hanging out in here. Chances are I'm probably going to have to run up to the freezer, bring down some fresh food so we could rebuild the feeding zone to keep the migration going. But I figured this go around I would try to take a little bit more of an optimistic spin on it and begin by simply inspecting the material. And who knows, maybe we'll just find some stuff in here that's already been completely evacuated with no worms in it at all. And then this bin will be done after 118 days and only 2 weeks of migrating the worms. So let's bring the camera in a little bit closer and begin with an inspection of the material and see how we're doing. So you probably noticed it earlier, but I didn't mention why they were here. But this container off to my right is in fact going to be the new home for these worms, and I was actually planning on extracting the worms today, and that's the reason I've got this little clear tray here so that I could scoop them out and place them in there temporarily until such a time that we're prepared to release them into their new environment. So that is also on the game plan for today, is to actually do the first haul of worms out of here and launch them into their new living quarters in the Vermibag tote, which is actually where they had resided prior to being relocated into this container here. So they're basically going back to where they came from, and it's a little bit more of a spacious container. It'll allow them to spread out a little bit better than they were able to previously. I'm going to leave the feeding area alone for now because, like I said earlier, I'd like to simply begin by sizing up how the migration is progressing. And I've kind of got my fingers crossed here. Let's hope that maybe we can actually call this a done deal. Wouldn't that be nice? I wonder what to expect in here. I guess I'll scoop over here and we'll start right on the edge, which is where we're probably most likely to still see some worms. This far edge is probably a lot more dry than this side. This is the only area that had plastic on it, allowing for the recirculation of moisture. over here with that piece of paper, it's been allowing it the opportunity to continue drying, because that was the one thing we noticed in here, was that the material was rather damp still. So last time too, I was using it as an opportunity to bring up some of this more damp material and get it to the surface. I believe I'm seeing a piece of plastic in here, so I'm pulling that out right now. And right here on the edge is where I guess we would expect to see some worms still hanging out. And we are spotting a couple already. Here's a fairly small one, here's a pretty good sized one. So I believe, you know, right off the bat, we could probably make the judgment call right away that we're not really prepared to mark off this batch of worm castings as complete yet. It does look like we're probably going to need to reset this feeding zone to encourage the ongoing migration of the worms out of the castings. But we're not seeing a huge number of worms. We are seeing a few here and there. And I would think that the majority of them are just simply gradually making their way over into the feeding area. You know, finding that over here there's really not much food remaining. So they go looking for a fresh supply of nourishment, which is exactly the idea. But yeah, you can really see that the material is pretty much depopulated for the large part. Here and there we're definitely bumping into a worm. But I guess as we work our way further and further away from the feeding area, we are seeing fewer and fewer worms. I just need to be careful because I am very limited on space here and I don't want to be spilling this stuff all over the table. I guess let's take a look on the very far edge, which is where we would expect to see the fewest number of worms, in the most distant portion of the bin away from the feeding zone. That is kind of what we're seeing here, is that it's pretty much castings only. I don't see any worms yet. So I don't want to go stirring all this stuff up and, you know, moving material with worms in it over onto this side. I do want to leave this side, you know, depopulated as it already is right now, because that is exactly what we're after here. I wouldn't want to undo 2 weeks of migration here by stirring all the material around. So this depopulated material will stay over on this edge. And what we'll do is we'll scoop out the worms from the feeding zone and get them ready for being launched into their new space. But before we do that, we'll probably pick out some of the food that they're inhabiting right now in that feeding zone, because I'm sure a lot of that could simply go right back into this bin to help us rebuild that feeding zone. If we need to, we can grab some fresh stuff from the freezer, but I'd like to just continue using whatever I can that's already been in here for some time and already partially broken down. Let's get any worms we spot right into the feeding area at this point, I guess. But yeah, I just thought it might make more sense to actually verify that there is still a need for the rebuild of the feeding zone, because there is still in fact more depopulation and more worm migration that needs to happen in here. Because in the past too, I believe I've, you know, gone ahead and rebuilt a feeding zone in a case like this, and then inspected the castings, only to find that the castings were already pretty much depopulated and there was really no more need for the feeding area. So it seemed like I didn't want to kind of put the cart before the horse, so to speak, and try to do things in a sequence that makes a little bit more sense this time. So yeah, let's not continue disturbing this stuff too much. I did want to, you know, definitely see if I can get some of the more damp stuff up off the bottom and closer to the surface where it has a better chance to air out and dry off a bit more, which in itself should also help encourage the worms to leave, because if the material is dry, they're not going to enjoy that and they're going to go looking for a more damp, cozy place to be. So whether it's in pursuit of food or whether it's in pursuit of a more damp, comfortable place to be, I'm trying to, you know, stack the cards in my favor, stack the deck in my favor, whatever that expression is, so that you know, we get the best possible results here. So I'm pretty much at the top edge here. Just trying to be careful not to dump it out. But I just want to give myself a little bit of breathing room here to more easily be able to manipulate this feeding area. Because we're going to pull the whole thing out for the most part. We'll pick through it, try to recycle some of the food items that have not been consumed yet so we can rebuild the feeding zone with it. But I'll probably have to make a quick run up to the freezer to fetch some more fresh food that we can use to rebuild this feeding zone with. This was another thing that I was doing during the last feeding too, was I've got some chopped up corn cob bits, and some of them are probably still scattered throughout this material. So if I find any of those, I don't want that to be a reason that the worms would stay in the material and just continue feeding on it. If I find any larger chunks of food like that, I'm definitely removing them. But I've been doing that over the past few weeks, and for the most part I think I've gotten the majority of them. But I also anticipated the very good likelihood that I didn't get them all, so it wasn't very surprising to find one there. But with all this stirring around and tilling that I've been doing, that was the only piece I found. So luckily we've been doing a pretty decent job picking all that stuff out and moving it over into the feeding area. So I've got a little bit of a landing pad here. I'm going to bring that piece of paper back. So what we'll do with this piece of paper that was covering things up here is we'll just kind of use it as a platform here so that I can rest our little clear tub on top of it so I don't have to make a huge mess in the process here. And if there's pieces of this that we can reuse, I'm going to do my best to sort of keep it separate from the worms themselves. Well, we'll pick through it in the end, I guess, and we'll just pick out anything that doesn't really need to be relocated with the worms, and anything that we can salvage and reuse in the reconstruction of this feeding zone, we'll keep it apart from the worms so that it can go back in here at some point. So we'll try to stack that stuff on one edge, all these pieces of paper and cardboard that could be reused as bedding when we rebuild, and any food bits that we find. I'm only questioning whether I've got enough space in this thing. I hope I do. So why don't we get to work here? Let's start extracting these little guys out of here. Let's see what we ended up with. Oh, it looks pretty good. Quite a nice number of worms already, right there in the first handful. Some of the food bits that we're going to see in here from last week's feeding might not be completely eaten yet. I fed with bits of apple, which might still be partially in here, uneaten. I think there was some banana. Chances are that banana probably did get gobbled up. Although a lot of this coffee that was sprinkled across the top still seems to be in here as well. Pretty sure what I'm seeing across the top is just the coffee that we covered the feeding area up with. Certainly seems like we've got the majority of the worms. I mean, compared to what we observed within the castings in terms of worms, number of worms, I mean, it does seem like we've got way more worms over here in the feeding zone as opposed to how many worms we spotted in the castings when we weren't rummaging around. So that's pretty promising. It does seem like we've probably successfully rounded up the lion's share of the worms in this bin. Oops. Spilled a little bit over there. So I think we could probably scoop one more handful here and not overflow this little tiny plastic container. And let's see what else we can salvage from here. This piece of cardboard was really just meant to serve as a little bit of a divider line to just help me more easily see where the feeding zone starts and where the finished castings are. Yeah, you know, let's just pick out a few more of these little bits here. If anything looks like finished castings, we're just going to leave it behind. Here's some more food, some more bedding bits. But it does seem to me like our migration here is progressing quite nicely. I wonder how much longer it's going to take for this stuff to truly get depopulated entirely. Feels to me like some of this stuff right here on the edge might not be castings, it might just be coffee. But that's fine too. I don't want to go crazy trying to separate stuff here. I really just wanted to get the first extraction of worms out of this bin taken care of. We're going to launch off our new African nightcrawler system using these guys. And I just wish I had some good way to tell how many worms I've actually got in here. So I'm going to set this aside here. And I believe we're going to reset very similar to the way we had it previously. If I see any other chunks over here that probably belong in the feeding area, I'll pull them out too. See, you know, more of these little rings of the corn cob, the diced up corn cob. That was food that was placed into this bin one feeding prior to the setup of the horizontal migration setup. So that's going back quite a few weeks, and in hindsight it might not have been the best type of food to feed a bin that you want to wind down, considering how long it takes for corn cob to break down typically in a worm bin. But hopefully it'll all come out in the wash eventually. I'm definitely finding more and more bits of it here. Maybe I can just sort of probe through the material here on the very edge to see if I can pick out any more of them, just in case they are still here. So I did just find 2 or 3 of them. And then we could stack all this stuff right back up again and set up the feeding zone. Yeah, I think I got the majority of it. I can tell from the color too, some of the stuff mixed in here is coffee. So hopefully the worms will nibble away at that and get rid of it, turn it into castings, and then not be deterred from going right past it into the new feeding zone. And once we get set up here, I believe I'm going to sort of put the dividing line kind of where it was, not needing to leave too much space, I believe, and then allowing for the entire level of this to be a little bit lower, because I don't like it this close to the edge. I don't want to feel like I'm going to be always dumping the material over the top rim every time I come in here to do something. So I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to see if I could pick out some of the food items from that plastic container that the worms are in, and try to leave the worms behind, but you know, or salvage as much of the food as possible, so we could use it to rebuild the feeding zone. So why don't I grab another tub that I can throw that stuff into as I pick it out, and then we'll have part of what we need to rebuild the feeding zone. I guess I could just place whatever I find right into here and hopefully leave as many worms behind as possible. So this isn't food, but it'll be perfect for bedding. This is part of the dividing cardboard that was placed in between the finished castings and the feeding area. So we'll definitely salvage as much of this bedding material as we can. That would also include this coffee filter here. Didn't really get consumed much. It's the one that I believe was resting right on top of the entire feeding area. There was another one though that we had placed down in the feeding area, which I believe probably would have gotten a lot more attention and would have been a lot more heavily consumed by the worms. This would be more of the divider cardboard that was placed in between the castings and the food. Definitely not usable as a divider anymore, but perfectly useful as a little bit of bedding that we could place under the food when we're rebuilding. So now we're actually coming up with some of the food items here, little corn cob bits. Lots and lots of bedding though, so they did do a pretty good job eating up the food that's been given to them. So even though we'll be able to recycle some of the food items that they had been working on previously, I think we are definitely going to need more to get a good enticing feeding zone built up for the remainder of the worms that we need to coax out of the finished castings. But yeah, you could see how these corn cob bits are still holding up really good. I had taken a corn cob and I had diced it into little rings. At first they were discs, but now they're rings because the inner portion of the cob is what the worms always seem to consume first. Just with corn cobs, it does take time. It's a very slow composting food item. Here's a good example to show that the worms are nibbling away at the inside of the corn cob bit. They obviously enjoy that part of it the best. Alright, so how do I leave the worms behind and take only the corn cob? I guess maybe I have to sort of shatter the ring a bit. I tried not to break these pieces whenever I encountered them. I thought that it'd just be easier to pick them out of the material if they were whole. So even though they break pretty readily at this point, I am typically trying to keep them as entire pieces if possible, just so I can more readily pick them out if I need to. Well, I'm going to keep picking away at this a little bit. Might not make for a very exciting video. So I think I'll pause the camera now and I'll still keep working this through for a little while and see what we come up with. And then we'll regroup in a couple minutes once I've gotten a little further through this. So I'll come back in a minute after I've made a little bit more progress on this. A number of you might be thinking to yourselves, my goodness, man, what are you doing there? Why don't you just take the whole bundle and dump it into the new location? How hard is it to grab some fresh newspaper and food and, just use new stuff to rebuild the feeding zone with? Well, I'll tell you why. I guess part of the thing I'm trying to do here, which I didn't mention earlier, is I do want to try to get a sense of how many worms I've got in here. So I thought that the easiest way to do that would be to, gradually pick through this stuff and allow the worms to dive down into the material, hopefully leaving almost only worms, which would get us a much better view of how many worms we managed to extract from here. I had even thought that maybe if I could, end up with only a pile of worms, then perhaps that I could even put it on the scale and weigh it to see how many worms we might have ended up with. I don't know if that'll help us really tell us how many worms we've got, but I would really like to at least visually get a better sense of how many we managed to get together here. So that's kind of my main motivation for wanting to, go through this extra effort of picking through here and, separating the worms from all the stuff that they're inhabiting right now. Mainly just so I can get a better view of what we ended up with. So I'm always curious to see how this population is doing. They really started out as a fairly small number of worms. I believe 100 cocoons is what I started with. Almost 500 days ago, I believe. And, over that time, it's kind of hard to say how many worms I've really got at this point. And it's during these harvests of the castings and the relocations of the worms, it's like the only real opportunity to try to gauge how many worms you've got in your population. So that was my only real reason for, taking that extra time to do what I'm doing here. So I'm not sure how much value it adds, but it's more or less just trying to satisfy my curiosity. So I just figured I'd mention that in case you're wondering. I'm sure you knew that already, but just for the record, that's my main motivation here for doing what I'm doing here. Yeah, besides it's fun. It's fun picking through here and messing with the worms. I just stumbled on another piece of paper that had been used as bedding here, and you could see how they really love to get into the folds of the paper. They really enjoy getting in between the layers of paper, and kind of makes it pretty easy for me to know exactly where to expect to find them. Just need to flatten the paper out, and there they are. But this piece of paper will also come in really handy for us to rebuild the feeding zone with. So it's definitely worth the effort to evacuate the worms from it and recycle it. Put it back into our feeding zone when we get around to that. Come on guys, get off. Alright, so I think we're making pretty good progress. Every time I pull a big chunk like this out, I feel like I'm really taking a good bite out of this pile of stuff. But it's probably not too important to get all the worms off. I just prefer to try to keep as many here in this little clear plastic tub as possible so I can maximize the number of worms that we launch that new bin off with. Alright, I think that should do. It's funny, the smell of this little piece of apple is almost like booze. It smells like the apple's fermenting. It might be turning into alcohol. I'm sure that's going to turn the worms on too. Oh, banana peel. All good stuff for rebuilding our feeding zone. So I've been diligently going back and forth through this material, trying to comb my fingers through it, trying to pick out any last remaining bits of corn or apple or larger chunks of paper and bedding and anything like that, so that what remains in here hopefully is, for the most part, they're finished castings and only worms. And you can see everything that I've compiled here. It's quite a stack. I don't want to tip it over to give you a sense of how tall this is, but this is a pretty tall stack over here. From the angle of the camera, it might not be so easy to see. But I do believe we're kind of at that point now. So what we're left with in here, I believe, is for the most part worms. Maybe you can argue that maybe, 20% of it is not worms, maybe 80% of it is worms. But yeah, if you start to really turn it over, you could see that they're continuously trying to burrow down out of the bright light, down into the material, try to take shelter from the light. So it is, pretty much worms only down here, and it's quite a bit. I mean, I went to the supermarket the other day to pick up a pound of ground beef. And it was pretty much exactly 1 pound. So I feel like I've got kind of a sense now so that I can judge what this weighs here. I mean, we could certainly put it on the scale too. But I would have to guess that we've probably got ourselves at least a pound of worms in here. I think that's a realistic estimate at this point. And I don't know, I think most people would typically equate 1 pound of worms to roughly 1,000 in terms of how many there are in quantity. And that's pretty good, considering that when I first got these African nightcrawlers, they came to me in the form of cocoons. So they weren't even worms yet. They were unhatched cocoons, 100 of them. And, over the past many hundred days, they've done pretty good multiplying. and expanding their population into what is probably, at this point, maybe 10 times as many. There again, that assumes each cocoon yields one worm, although I think that could be incorrect. I'm not exactly sure how many worms typically emerge from a African nightcrawler cocoon. So I'm not sure exactly how many I began with. If anybody out there happens to know what a typical African nightcrawler cocoon yields in terms of how many baby worms can emerge from it, I believe certain breeds of worms, multiple worms can emerge from a single cocoon. So it would be interesting to know the approximate number that this population started with, because then we can start comparing it to where they stand today, which is maybe 1,000 or so, possibly more. And then we've still got some more that we need to try to evacuate from the remaining castings too. So I think it's time to start using all of this reclaimed material here to rebuild the feeding zone in the bin. And then we can give these little guys a little chance to just relax now that I've been massaging them and disturbing them for I don't know how long. Let them chill out. We'll certainly all dive down into this material just to get away from the bright lights, and then at the end we'll go ahead and we'll release them into their new home. Alright, let me go ahead and rebuild the feeding zone with this stuff right here. So now I've gone upstairs and grabbed my little container full of kitchen scraps, and I've also taken the time to fashion a new barrier wall. So back down in here within the worm bin, I guess we just need to sort of decide where we want our feeding zone to be. And I believe that that should be adequate. I believe that might even be larger in space than what the original one was, so maybe I'll even nudge it back just a hair more. I think that's good because that'll leave a good amount of volume over here, a lot of space that we can backfill this to get the level of this back down low again. But now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start returning all of this reclaimed bedding and reclaimed food back into the feeding zone. It does seem like, you know, just the amount of reclaimed bedding I've got here, now you can get a better view of the stack, but I don't want to tip it over too much. Probably is plenty for us to lay down as the bedding for this feeding area. So let's see if I can do a balancing act here and carefully start putting this partially broken down bedding down into the feeding area. Here we've got some of these larger pieces of paper that I had extracted along the way. There was the paper towel, and there were a couple other pieces of I believe coffee filter that were not completely disintegrated yet. So I'm going to set those aside, I guess. Maybe we'll use those closer to the top to try to cover up with a little bit more. Here too is coffee filter, right? Let's see if we can keep these larger pieces separate. This, on the other hand, was the old barrier. I believe that'll just go right down there on the bottom. So I'll try to spread this stuff out kind of evenly along the bottom so we can rest all of the food onto that as well. Starting to make a little bit of a mess here. Let's see if we can keep things from getting out of hand. So I want it to be layered, so I did preserve a little bit of the reclaimed bedding bits as well as these larger bedding bits for us to try to cover up with. So let's just dump in all of the reclaimed food now. I'm just going to hold the bin in such a way that my hand is holding down all these reclaimed bedding bits so we could use them at the end to cover up with. But now we're going to drop in all of this uneaten apple and banana peel and obviously corn bits. Spread it out there, and we got ourselves a pretty nice little feeding area now, just using the reclaimed food that was not yet eaten. But since I bought some down, let's go ahead and use some. I bought down, I guess, some cabbage, some cauliflower, I don't think we need much more, so I'll just grab a little bit of smaller fragments from the bottom of the bag, which is just a variety of other things, including some carrot peels. So our feeding zone is starting to look pretty nice here. On top, I guess we'll just start using all of the rest of this reclaimed bedding that we salvaged. Cover up the feeding zone a little bit. Also got a few fragments of the cardboard I fashioned into our divider wall. And I think I'll just throw a little bit of grit in here too, just to help things along in case we've got some baby worms that need it. But at this point I believe we can pretty much return all the rest of this reclaimed bedding in here as sort of top cover. Just something I like to do over my feeding zones, you know, because I don't want to have insects attracted to my worm bins since I do my composting indoors. If I was outdoors, I wouldn't worry so much about intruding insects. A lot of intruding insects actually help a lot with the composting process, but in my house, I try to limit the composting creatures to worms only, if possible. And now I believe we can actually start backfilling this void over here to try to get the level back down to a normal place where it's not so close to spilling over the edge and overflowing. Somehow to me the material still seems a little more damp than what I would want it to be, so it is probably a good idea that I'm covering up with only newspaper. That will allow for a little bit of moisture to escape. But the plastic will go right back over the top of the feeding area once again, just to make sure that the moisture trying to escape from there can't. And it kind of creates this terrarium effect where the moisture definitely stays over there if possible. But you know what else I'm going to do? Now that the worms have actually burrowed down into this pile here, I'm thinking we could probably return a lot of this stuff here and pretty easily skim it off the worms without bringing many or any worms with us at all. So a lot of this is still bits of uneaten food or bits of bedding scraps, and then that'll permit us even a better view of the remaining worms that are left behind in this relocation. Because I am very interested in getting a good sense of how many I've managed to round up here over the past 2 weeks. So I saw this as kind of one last ditch opportunity to return some of this casting material and bedding material back into the bin and leave us with more or less only worms in this in the end if possible. So obviously I did relocate a few worms back into the active worm bin, which isn't the end of the world. They're already in the feeding zone now, so they're in the best possible place they can be. I didn't return them back into the finished castings area. And at this point we've got ourselves much less excess material and much more of a highly concentrated worm-only kind of a migration relocation happening here, I believe. And I guess once we dump this into the vermibag, we'll have a better view of how many we managed to round up. And I'm sure over the next few minutes before we get around to doing that, they'll continue squirming down, once again trying to retreat away from the bright overhead lights. But it certainly looks to me like we've got ourselves a pretty good haul here. Pretty cool, eh? Alright, let's get this setup covered up again, back up on the shelf, and we could proceed to the launching of our new African nightcrawler system with the relocated worms. Very nice. So as I'll do from time to time, I'll break out this little scale here and It actually does display the weight information, not only in ounces, pounds, and ounces, which is the current setting. It would be ounces and pounds. There's also the option to go metric. But right now it is set to 0, so let's go ahead and let's drop on the container and see what we ended up with here. So I guess we're talking, this is kilograms at this point, so I'm assuming we're very close to a half there. And if we switch over, what we're left with is 1 pound and 1 ounce. So we've got to remember that we need to factor in the weight of the plastic container as well as all the material in here that's not worms. So I don't know, I'm not sure. What do I estimate this to be? I would have to say maybe 12 ounces of worms in the end, not quite 1 pound. So if it's 3/4 of 1 pound, then maybe it equates to about 700 or 800 worms. I don't know. What do you think? Is the 1 pound to 1,000 quantity the right ratio between the weight and the number when it comes to African nightcrawlers? I don't know. I usually use red wigglers, and usually I use that equation to estimate the number of red wigglers that make up 1 pound, but maybe it's fewer. Maybe since these are a larger worm, maybe it takes fewer worms to make up 1 pound. So maybe we're only talking about 500, 700. It's hard to say. So I don't know. I'd love to hear people's ideas in terms of how many worms they think we've got here. So please put your comments down below. All right, let's get these guys released into their new home. So I'm going to be using the VermiBag tote for this, and this is where the worms had been previously. Last time I ran the African nightcrawlers, and they went from here into the green tub, and now they're going back into here. Except this go around, I'm going to use this VermiBag tote a little bit differently. Since I use my own cardboard and plastic coverings, I'm just going to take this zip top cover and not even use it. I'm going to just roll it up. I've rolled it up and tucked it in. And I've decided I'm just going to run this bin, much like a regular bin. Obviously, it's getting the benefit of, a lot of airflow that can come and go in and out of the bin through the fabric. And in the place of using the zip top lid, I'm just going to use covers that are much more similar to what you see in all of my other bins, which is typically a cardboard covering just to allow for some darkness underneath. And then the reason I like to leave the darkness is because a lot of the evaporating moisture that tries to escape the bin when it gets caught by this plastic layer can drop right onto this paper layer. And this paper layer becomes a real tempting spot for the worms because all the collecting moisture that would have otherwise escaped the bin lands right there. It ends up becoming kind of a fun thing to see when you open up your bin, a whole bunch of worms hanging out right there, trying to take advantage of the moisture. So this bin was built pretty recently, just a couple days ago, and it's been priming ever since, just waiting for the new inhabitants to arrive. And even though a lot of the material in here was pretty much dry when I first placed it in here, there were some frozen foods added to this. I was moistening the material as I went, as I built the bin, spraying the material down, try to get it nice and moist. So even though the stuff at the very surface feels like it's drying out a little bit, I'm fairly confident that the average moisture of the material within the bin is probably pretty cozy for the worms. But you know what, just for good measure, I'm going to spray the top of this down just a little bit, just so it's not all dry, and then we'll throw the worms in. Alright, so if you're interested in seeing the video that I created when I built this bin, it was actually the last video that I posted on my channel. I can go ahead and I could put a link to it right up in the corner of the screen, right up here, and just check that out if you're interested in seeing it. But without further ado, I think it's time to release our worms into their new home. Look at that. It must be mostly worms, because otherwise they would have burrowed down underneath the material and kicked it up to the surface. So I think what we have here is mainly worms. All right, in you go. Nope, I think we got all of them. Good job. Let's spread them out a little bit because I hate leaving them in a big pile. They sometimes have a hard time getting past one another to be able to burrow down into the material below, so I like to try to spread them out, give them all equal access to the surface of the bin right below so they can all get out of the bright light as quickly as possible. It also gives us a slightly better view of how many worms we ended up with here. So let's give these little guys a few minutes to get acclimated, and then we'll be finished. I see a small piece of plastic in here that seems to have gone along for the ride with the castings. Oops, where did it go? Doesn't belong in the worm bin, so I'm throwing it away. But I think we're pretty much done here. For all intents and purposes, our worms have retreated into the bedding. There's obviously still a little bit of worm activity here on the surface. They've not all made it down into the container yet, but I think we've given these guys enough action for one day. It's time to let them rest and relax and get cozy into their new home. So I'm going to start trying to make this into a slightly more comfortable place for them with some darkness. And put the bin back up on the shelf so they can make themselves at home in their new, slightly larger, hopefully more comfortable container. So, as we usually do at this point, every time I launch a new bin, before I put it back up on the shelf, right here on the side of the container is where I like to put the label indicating to me the day that the bin was launched. Usually you only see a date, but in the case when I've got night crawlers, I like to indicate what type of night crawler it is. Even though the majority of my worms are red wigglers, in this bin I want to be able to clearly see that these are the African night crawlers. So, that's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. Just hit the subscribe button. Be sure to ring the bell too, because that's really appreciated. So hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.